An excerpt from Mervyn Peake's Titus Groan, the first novel in the Gormenghast series. Chapter 17, Means of Escape. Mr. Flay was possessed by two major vexations. The first of these lay in the feud which had arisen between himself and the mountain of pale meat, the feud that had flared up and fructified in his assault upon the chef. He avoided, even more scrupulously than before, any corridor, quadrangle, or cloister where the unmistakable proportions of his enemy might have loomed in sight. As he performed his duties, Mr. Flay was perpetually aware that his enemy was in the castle, and was haunted by the realization that some devilish plot was being devised, momently in that dropsical head. Some infernal hatching. In a word, revenge. What opportunities the chef would find or make, Flay could not imagine, but he was constantly on the alert, and was for even turning over in his dank skull any possibilities that occurred to him. If Flay was not actually frightened, he was at least apprehensive to a point this side of fear. The second of his two anxieties hinged upon the disappearance of Steerpike. 14 days ago he had locked the urchin up, and had returned 12 hours later with a jug of water and a dish of potatoes, only to find the room empty. Since then there had been no sign of him, and Mr. Flay, although uninterested in the boy for his own sake, was nevertheless disturbed by so phenomenal a disappearance, and also by the fact that he had been one of Swelter's kitchen hands, and might, were he to return to the fetid regions from which he had strayed, disclose the fact that they had met, and probably, in a garbled version of the affair, put it to the chef that he had been lured away from his province, and incarcerated for some sinister reason of his own invention. Not only this, for Mr. Flay remembered how the boy had overheard the remarks which Lord Groan had made about his son. Remarks which would be detrimental to the dignity of Gormenghast if they were to be noised abroad to the riff-raff of the castle. It would not do if at the very beginning of the new Lord Groan's career it were common knowledge that the child was ugly, and that Lord Sepulchrave was distressed about it. What could be done to ensure the boy's silence, Flay had not yet determined, but it was obvious that to find him was the prime necessity. He had, during his off moments, searched room by room, balcony after balcony, and had found no clue as to his whereabouts. At night, as he lay before his master's door, he would twitch and awake, and then sit bolt upright on the cold floorboards. At first, the face of Swelter would appear before his eyes, huge and indistinct, with those beady eyes in their folds of flesh, cold and remorseless. He would shoot his hard-cropped head forward, and wipe the sweat from his palms upon his clothes. Then, as the foul phantom dissolved in the darkness, his mind would lure him into the empty room where he had last seen Steerpike, and in his imagination he would make a circuit of the walls, feeling the panels with his hands, and come at last to the window, where he would stare down the hundreds of feet of sheer wall to the yard below. Straightening out his legs again, his knee joints would crack in the darkness as he stretched himself out, the iron-tasting key between his teeth. What had actually happened in the octagonal room, and the subsequent events that befell Steerpike, are as follows. When the boy heard the key turn in the lock, he half ran to the door, and glued his eye to the keyhole, and watched the seat of Mr. Flay's trousers receding down the passage. He had heard him turn a corner, and then a door was shut in the distance with a far bang, and thereafter there had been silence. Most people would have tried the handle of the door. The instinct, however irrational, would have been too strong, the first impulse of one who wishes to escape. Steerpike looked at the knob of the door for a moment. He had heard the key turn. He did not disobey the simple logic of his mind. He turned from the only door in the room, and leaning out of the window, glanced at the drop below. His body gave the appearance of being malformed, but it would be difficult to say exactly what gave it this gibbous quality. Limb by limb it appeared that he was sound enough, but the sum of these several members accrued to an unexpectedly twisted total. His face was pale like clay, and save for his eyes, mask-like. These eyes were set very close together and were small, dark red, and of startling concentration. The striped kitchen tunic which he wore fitted him tightly. On the back of his head was pushed a small white skull cap. As he gazed down quietly at the precipitous drop, he pursed his mouth, and his eyes roved quickly over the quadrangle below him. Then suddenly he left the window, and with his peculiar half-run, half-walk, he hurried around the room, as though it were necessary for him to have his limbs moving concurrently with his brain. Then he returned to the window. Everything was stillness. The afternoon light was beginning to wane in the sky, although the picture of turrets and rooftops enclosed by the window frame was still warmly tinted. He took one last comprehensive glance over his shoulder at the walls and ceiling of the prison room, and then, clasping his hands behind his back, returned his attention to the casement. This time, leaning precariously over the sill and with his face to the sky, he scrutinized the rough stones of the wall above the lintel, and noticed that after 20 feet they ended at a sloping roof of slates. This roof terminated in a long horizontal spine like a buttress, which in turn led in great sweeping curves towards the main rooftops of Gormenghast. The 20 feet above him, although seeming at first to be unscalable, were, he noticed, precarious only for the first 12 feet, where only an occasional jutting of irregular stone offered dizzy purchase. Above this height, a gaunt, half-dead creeper that was matted grayly over the slates lowered a hairy arm which, unless it snapped at his weight, would prove comparatively easy climbing. Steerpike reflected that once astride the cornice, he could, with relatively little difficulty, make his way over the whole outer shell of central Gormenghast. Again he fastened his gaze upon the first dozen feet of vertical stone, choosing and scrutinizing the grips that he would use. His survey left him uneasy. It would be unpleasant. The more he searched the wall with his intense eyes, the less he liked the prospect. But he could see that it was feasible if he concentrated every thought and fiber upon the attempt. He hoisted himself back into the room, that had suddenly added an atmosphere of safety to its silence. 2 courses were open to him. He could either wait, and in due course presumably Flay would reappear and would, he suspected, attempt to return him to the kitchens. Or he could make the hazardous trial. Suddenly, sitting on the floor, he removed his boots and tied them by their laces about his neck. Then he rammed his socks into his pockets and stood up. Standing on tiptoe in the middle of the room, he splayed his toes and felt them tingle with awareness, and then he pulled his fingers sideways cruelly, awakening his hands. There was nothing to wait for. He knelt on the windowsill and then, turning around, slowly raised himself to his feet and stood outside the window, the hollow twilight at his shoulder blades.